So last fall, coming up on a year now, our family went to Paris, and it's something that my wife and I have come to love. We've been there a couple of times, and we've really enjoyed it. But this time, last year, around this time last year, we took our kids. I have a 17-year-old, a 13-year-old. I feel like I've been here enough to stop saying that I have teenagers, but for those of you that may be new, we got two kids, and we took them to Paris, and I was really thrilled to take them there because we were now inviting them into this thing that was really special to my wife and I, this place, the rhythms that we had when we visited the Paris. And while we were there, we visited the Louvre, the museum, the very famous and popular museum there. And I was very, very excited to show them the Mona Lisa. So much so that I rushed us past all the other exhibits, right? All the artifacts, the paintings, the sculptures. We just rushed right past them. But on the way to the Mona Lisa, we got lost a few times because if you've been to any museum, I feel like the directions on the little map that they give you are never accurate. So we got lost a few times and we made a few wrong turns. We even came across hallways that would have made the trip a little shorter to the Mona Lisa that were closed off. So the whole thing just made me very, very frustrated and irritable as we made our way to this thing that I wanted to share with my kids. Hayden, my youngest, our 13-year-old, however, she had a very positive attitude. She always does. She's like this little thing. She mostly does. She's like this little thing. And she had a very positive attitude. She was very upbeat and ready to go. She was just excited to be there. She was also the only one small enough to kind of navigate through the crowd. So when we finally get to the room that exhibits the Mona Lisa, we should have known this, but it was absolute chaos. Like people everywhere, people talking in different languages, people wearing their earpiece, people, you don't know if they're cursing at you, you know what's happening. And so here we are after taking several wrong turns, after seeing closed hallways, after seeing the chaotic crowds, we get to the room where the Mona Lisa is, and there's this massive crowd that puts you at like 40, 50 feet away from the actual exhibit. Hayden, in her very positive attitude, was the smallest one, small enough to kind of make her way through the crowds. And so she did. And so I'm watching the crowds and I'm trying to make sure that I don't lose my daughter. As scrappy as I think Hayden is, I didn't want to lose her in a foreign country. And so I'm just keeping my eyes on her, and she's like ducking and weaving through the crowd. And then I finally caught a glimpse of what I didn't know I needed to see. It was the masterpiece that I nearly missed. And you see a picture of it here. I think you will. Y'all see it? So there she is. This picture is very layered, tons of meaning here. But the thing that really drew my attention is her face. Here I was, enamored with the idea of curating this experience for my kids and for our family. And I was frustrated, distracted by my frustration, my anger, all of the wrong turns, all of the things that were agitating me. And my daughter didn't care. My daughter made her way there. And the irony here, at least in this picture, is everyone's capturing the Mona Lisa. And the only thing that drew my attention was this little girl that was just happy to be there. She didn't care about my plans necessarily. She didn't care about what I curated for our family. She was just happy that we were in a different country, that we were with the family, and that we were enjoying this art, and that we were doing it together. And it was at that moment that I realized that I was missing the forest for the trees. I was so fixated on getting the kids to the Mona Lisa that I became blind to the most important thing that was happening right in front of me. That everyone was together and just happy to be there. And that moment, if I'm honest, reminds me of our text today, right? That moment reminded me of how easy it is to miss the deeper, truer, more beautiful moment right in front of us because we're so obsessed with a goal, a fear, a rule, or an image that we think we need to preserve. And as you'll see when we read John chapter 5, this is exactly what's unfolding in the story. So John chapter 5, I'm reading from the CSB. We're going to read the first 16 verses just so that we can get the full picture of what's happening. John 5, 1 through 16. It says, after this, a Jewish festival took place, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. By the sheep gate in Jerusalem, there was a pool called Bethsaida in Aramaic, which had 5 colonnades. Within these lay a large number of the disabled community, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man that was there had been disabled for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and realized he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to get well?" Verse 7 always feels sarcastic to me. "Sir," the disabled man answered, "I have no one to put me in the pool when the waters are stirred up, but while I am coming, someone goes down ahead of me to the pool." "Get up," Jesus told him, "pick up your mat and walk." Instantly, the man got well, picked up his mat, and started to walk. Now that day was the Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "This is the Sabbath. The law prohibits you from picking up your mat." He replied, "The man who made me well told me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" "Who is this man who told you to pick up your mat and walk?" they asked. But the man who was healed did not know who it was, because Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. After this, Jesus found him again in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Do not sin anymore, so that something worse does not happen to you." The man went then and reported to the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews began persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath, hinting towards the fact that this story is not an isolated story. Jesus has been doing these things. Jesus does these things, particularly on the Sabbath. Jesus is somewhat of a provocateur. He likes provocation. So my wife tells me that I'm always provocative. I am in good company. But I love what happens here in this story, and I think there's a few things that we can pull out of it. The first is, don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Hopefully that phrase and that invitation makes a little sense as we unpack this idea. Let me start with the thing that catches my attention the most out of this story. The thing that catches my attention the most out of this story is the response of the Jewish leaders to the man who was healed. Their response is very fascinating to me, right? And look, we're going to talk about the weird question that Jesus asks in verse 6. I think it's a weird question. Do you want to get well? I'm like, Jesus, are you not paying attention? Read the room. Like, what's happening? Like, it's a weird question, and we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about Jesus' interaction with the lame man and then the lame man's response to what Jesus does. We're going to talk about all that. But I think that understanding what happens between verses 9 and 13 is really important in order to make sense of what Jesus does for the lame man, right? If you don't have a deep understanding of what happens in these 4 or 5 verses, then I think you're going to have a harder time understanding why Jesus did what he did and why I think it's so significant what he did for this lame man. So after Jesus healed the man, the Jewish leaders pressed this guy for having done something that they believe their law and tradition prohibits him from doing. We read this, right? So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "Yo, this is the Sabbath. The law prohibits you from picking up your mat and walking." And there's an interesting response by the Jewish leaders here. It's interesting because these Jewish leaders who are now protesting his healing is the same group of leaders who failed to notice him the other 38 years. They are the ones protesting his healing, but they are also part of the group of people that fail to notice him for the previous 38 years that he laid lame and paralyzed in the same spot. Suddenly, on the day of his miraculous healing, they take interest in him. That's really fascinating to me. And it's also not the kind of kind interest, compassionate interest. It is the kind of judgmental and confrontational interest that they take in this man. Now, considering the circumstances of this lame man, anyone from the neighborhood, anyone from Jerusalem, anyone from that town knows exactly where he is. Knowing the circumstance of this man, everybody in the neighborhood knows exactly where he is and knows exactly where to find him. He wasn't going anywhere because, according to the text that we read, no one was even willing to help him from the very spot that he was sitting in for 38 years. And any attempt that he had, someone would scoop right in and take his spot in the pool. So if you are looking for him, you know where to find him. Where you saw him last week is where he is today. Where he was yesterday is where he is today, if you're interested in actually looking for him. But church, I think that's exactly it. I think this whole ordeal, right, this frustration coming from this group of Jewish leaders isn't about the lame man at all. It's about them. It's about their ability to maintain control, to maintain the tradition that they have been given to uphold. It's about their ability to protect that tradition. It's about their ability to protect what I would call that leadership culture, the way things are done around here. Now, you don't have to be a Jewish leader to understand this, right? Your family has a culture. Your family talks about money a certain way. Your family talks about sex a certain way. Your family talks about grief a certain way. That's just the way things are done in the Perez family. This is culture. So part of what these Jewish leaders are trying to protect is the way things are done in this tradition. But I'm not convinced that these guys are actually interested in the lame man. You see, if you're interested in someone, you know where to find them. They're interested in themselves. Their response to this man's healing is interesting because it's as if they're saying something about how they identify. Here's what I mean. The way they respond to this man's healing signals to us, the reader, how they define themselves, how these Jewish leaders define themselves. They define themselves by what they don't do. Right? Or to put it another way, they define themselves by what they vow to keep themselves from. We are known by what we don't do. And the further you understand this, the more you realize that if they define themselves by that way, then that becomes the case that they make against Jesus. Let me give you all some examples from the New Testament. Examples of these Jewish leaders using how they define themselves. We define ourselves by what we don't do or what we vow to keep ourselves from, and that becomes the argument against Jesus. Here's what they say throughout the New Testament. Hey, we don't eat with tax collectors and sinners. Why do you, Jesus? Or, we don't come to the table without washing ourselves as commanded by Moses. Why do you? Jesus, we don't pick grain from the field on the Sabbath. Why do you allow your disciples to pick grain on the Sabbath? That's really interesting to me because it feels like a really weird way to define your righteousness. Right? If you define your righteousness by what you don't do, I feel like you're missing the essence of why you've been made righteous. Right? If I say I am right with God because I keep myself from these things, if that's the essence of how you define yourself, then I feel like you're missing out on the dynamic reasons that we have been brought into this family through Jesus. I have a bit of a confession. What I described earlier about our Mona Lisa adventure as enthusiasm, it wasn't enthusiasm. There was some enthusiasm. I was really excited to show the kids the painting and just the whole experience out there. But it wasn't mostly enthusiasm. What I called enthusiasm was actually a kind of low-grade fear that I had that was motivating my behavior as we walked through the museum. The fear was that all these little obstacles, right, the closed hallways, the chaotic crowds, the wrong turns, the distance from the actual painting, like all of these little frustrating experiences that we were going through on the way to the Mona Lisa, my fear was that it would ruin the experience at the museum and that it would ruin what I curated for our family to experience on this trip. I take a lot of pride in my ability to curate an experience. I take a lot of pride in that. And so when we had this trip planned, I created an itinerary. I did my best to kind of give ourselves option. I put in some breaks in the schedule because I really wanted this to be a worthwhile trip. You know, it ain't cheap going to the other side of the world. So I'm like, we're going to juice this trip. It's going to be good, right? But my fear was that the wrong turns, the closed hallways, the crowds, the weather, it was hot, all of that would ruin the experience, and it would be a direct reflection on my ability to curate a really dope time. It sounds a little melodramatic, I know, but it's true. I'm just being honest, right? Like some of the things that inspired my frustration as we walked through the museum. And even more so, I felt that the kids were going to think that time at the museum was boring and uninteresting, but even more so that they would think that I am boring and uninteresting. And in my fear, I became irritable. I had very little patience for wrong turns and closed hallways or, Lord, people taking selfies. I had very little patience for that as we walked through the museum. My fear made me very irritable. And funny enough, I didn't become uninteresting as I feared I would. In fact, I became difficult to be around. I was jagged. I was rigid. I was mechanical. I was cold. There is a kind of religion that does that to us. There is a kind of religion that makes you rigid and mechanical and cold and difficult to be around. It's the religion that makes you over-concerned with structures and customs, not mercy. It's the religion that makes you over-occupied with tradition, not freedom. It's the religion that makes you all of these things. And when we become that kind of religious, is because our fears have gone unexamined and unconfronted. We become this kind of religious when we don't take a close look at our fears, we don't examine them, and we don't confront them. So, while this man was paralyzed, he was invincible. You just couldn't see him. While he was paralyzed, he might as well have been invisible. Someone you walk past. But when he was healed by Jesus and began to exercise his power over the things that kept him bound for 38 years, suddenly he became very visible. Suddenly this man became very visible. But not only did he become visible, he became problematic. I find that very fascinating. That for 38 years, he might as well have been invisible. But after he's healed and he exercises power over the thing that has kept him bound for 38 years, he becomes visible suddenly and problematic. Like this is a problem that we see him. He became problematic to those who were concerned with traditions and customs more than they were to human suffering. We are this kind of religious when we are fearful. And look, let me be honest. This isn't an indictment on these religious leaders. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I don't think that I'm trying to claim an indictment on these religious people. In fact, I think that I am trying to give a valiant effort to humanize them. Because the difference between an overly religious person and a spiritually healthy person lies in how we process our fears. Every one of us is going to experience deep fears and deep worries. And the difference between you becoming an overly cold, mechanical, religious person and a spiritually healthy, free person is how you process those fears. Religion, the unhealthy kind, is born out of our fears. Our fear of inadequacy, our fear of change, our fear of losing control, our fear of death, our fear of insignificance. And instead of examining those fears, we create systems and traditions around them to keep them at arm's length, to keep them away from ourselves and from anyone else. The question for us is, are we this kind of religious? Are you this kind of religious? Are you the kind of religious that overlooks those in need until their circumstances challenge your comfort? Are you the kind of religious that overlooks a person's need until they challenge your comfort, until they challenge the established way of life? What do you get worked up about? What does it say about what you value most? Or are we the kind of religious that James chapter 1 verse 27 says? I'll read it to you. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Or is it like what Moses actually says as he establishes the law? This is a really fascinating passage in Deuteronomy chapter 5, where Moses is giving the people of Israel the law. Hey, this is what God says, right? I'm giving you this law. This is what he says in Deuteronomy 5:15. He says, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath. The essence of the Sabbath is lost to these religious leaders. Think about James 1, what we just read. Think about Deuteronomy 5, that at the very essence of both religion and the Sabbath, or the invitation to rest, is this reminder of God's character of mercy and compassion. He says this is pure religion, that you look after orphans and widows in their distress. This is why I gave you the Sabbath, that you would remember the character of God, that his mercy, his power, his outstretched arm is what brought you out of your own slavery. What's interesting to me about this whole thing, in the context of the bedrock that we're trying to set here, is that these religious leaders in the passage that we're reading today were all worked up about the Sabbath not being honored, while failing to realize that there is an inseparable connection between Sabbath, mercy, and liberation. There is an inseparable connection between those things. And these guys are out here like, yo, cool, you walking, but you can't do that. They're worked up about what they're not supposed to be doing on the Sabbath, while at the same time failing to realize the purpose of the Sabbath. Are we that kind of religious? Are we that kind of mechanical? Are we that kind of cold? The Sabbath was meant to be a reminder of the ways that God has been kind, merciful, and powerful enough to rescue us from our own selfishness. And this, church, is the forest that we miss for the trees. In our seasons of waiting, whatever you may be waiting for, clarity from God, a relationship, whether friendship or romantic, to clear up, a job opportunity, whatever it is that you are waiting for, not only is it important not to miss the forest for the trees, but if we're going to be resilient in this season of waiting, we also have to remember that the voice that liberates us. So not only is it important for us to not miss the forest for the trees, but it's also important for us to be remembering the voice that liberates. All right, let's talk about verse 6, Jesus, his question. I read this instinctively, I'm like, Jesus, you got to read the room, bro. Like, well, you can't ask this question. Like, do you want to be healed? You're in a room. I feel like y'all don't like me insulting Jesus like that. I feel like y'all, it's like, yo, what he saying about Jesus? I appreciate that. But Jesus, kind of at first read, you're like, Jesus, come on, bro. Like, do you want to be healed? Like, you're in a room full of people that need healing. I'm sure they all want to be healed, right? The question, I feel like I'm going to get jumped after this. All right, so the question feels very unnecessary. Feels very unnecessary when I read it. But it may be a brilliant question, actually. What I thought was an absurd question instinctively may perhaps be a very brilliant question on Jesus' part. Here's what I mean. Maybe the man has been paralyzed for so long that his sense of what is possible has been calcified. You ever been in a season like that? That what you think is possible, whatever organ in us that produces imagination and possibility and hope, whatever organ that is, has been calcified by our life experiences. And I'm aware that this might be the case for this man who's been sitting in the same place for 38 years. That maybe he has stopped expecting anything new, anything different. Which is perhaps why he gives the answer that he does. Like, yo, do I want to be? Look, I've been sitting here. Any chance I get to even move, someone steps in the way. This is what's been happening for 38 years. So maybe what I thought was an absurd question is probably a really brilliant one. Here's what I mean. I could imagine that after 38 years of waiting for help, getting into the pool, the lame man's attitude about this shifted pretty dramatically. And here's what I mean. In the early going of this life, let's just assume we don't have the context in this passage. We only have our divine imagination to go off of. Let's just assume that this guy is in his early 40s, right? He's in his early 40s. That means that he has been lame. Maybe there's a Bible scholar out here that knows exactly how old this guy is, but I am not the one. So I'm going to just assume he's in his early 40s. That means that this guy has been lame and paralyzed for practically all of his life. And I would imagine that in the very early years of his life, of him being by this pool, which was believed to be a deeply divine pool, that a spirit would move or an angel would move, and that anyone that gets to a pool would be healed. I would imagine that the early years, he was probably very expectant. Very hopeful. Like, I just got to get to the water. I just got to get to the water, bro. But maybe that hopeful expectation turned into frustration after 2 years of the same result. And then it probably turned into disappointment after 5 years. And then it probably turned into cynicism after year 10. And then this man is utterly in despair after 38 years of the same. Now, look, none of this is in the text, but I know that I've been in seasons where I've been expecting something, and over the course of whatever time God has kept that thing from me, or that thing that I've been praying for, that I have naturally gone through the cycle of both expectation, eager expectation, frustration that it hasn't happened, disappointment that it hasn't happened, cynicism that it won't happen, despair that I just will unravel. And I want to bet that I'm not the only one who's been through that. And then verse 6 says Jesus realized that he had been there a long time. I'm not sure what gave it away because the text doesn't say. Maybe it was his smell, or maybe it was his appearance. It could very, very well have been any of those two. But one thing's for sure, whether it was his smell or his appearance, something Jesus saw prompted the question. And considering what we know, considering this context, Jesus' question now takes on a profound significance. It feels less like a weird question and more like an invitation. An invitation to rediscover what perhaps he had in the early stages, or probably what he had that got him to the pool. This feels like less like a weird question and more like a powerful invitation to rediscover hope and possibility. Now, part of the things that you have to remember about the historical context of this time is that people, the people of God in this time, in order to discern what God wanted, would turn to mainly two things, or three things, I guess you can say. Their community is one, the law of Moses and the prophets. They would turn to those people, they would turn to those resources in order to discern what it is that God would want for them. And particularly something that comes out of the prophet that speaks to this little moment. In Jeremiah 17, it says this: do not pick up a load or a mat or a burden. Do not pick up a burden or a mat and bring it through Jerusalem's gate on the Sabbath. That is something that is specifically said in the prophets of God. So you could imagine that when Jesus in these verses says something very different from what the prophets are saying, refreshingly new from what the prophets are saying, I could imagine that he didn't want to hear the same old word that he heard from the prophets, this lame man. Because probably what he was used to hearing was, hey, be careful, don't pick up your mat, it's the Sabbath. Don't nobody want to hear that, especially not this man. Why? He didn't want to hear because for this man, that word isn't liberating. I know that sounds a little interesting to hear, that there is some tension with this guy having to grapple with something that the text says, something that the prophet has said. That word to this man is not liberating, and certainly brings no release, certainly not the way that these religious leaders were leveraging the word. The law, at least the way that these group of Jewish leaders were leveraging, it lacks hope and it lacks vision. In fact, I would make the argument that this law becomes burdensome and cruel to this man, because it is a consistent reminder of what he cannot do. Hey, be careful, don't pick up your mat, it's the Sabbath. It's like, bro, I can't pick up the mat on the Sabbath on any day. That's not a word he needs to be reminded of. So hear me when I say this. That's not a word that man needed to be reminded of. So when Jesus comes in and he offers the response that he is giving him in these verses, it must have been deeply, deeply refreshing to him. He is someone willing to say, Jesus is someone willing to say something new, something different, but not just different, something bold and something outrageous, even if it was something risky. Because what if he was wrong? What y'all think about that? What if he was wrong? What if Jesus tells him to pick up his mat and it don't work? Not only would it have made Jesus look foolish, but it would have been incredibly cruel to that man. But of course, we know the story and we know the person. It works. His word works. Jesus' words are powerful. They're living. They healed the man and empowered him to do what he was not able to do for 38 years. His word, Jesus' words, granted the man the ability to do what under Jewish leadership he could not have been permitted to do. Jesus' commands empowered him to pick up his mat and walk, Sabbath or not. And with a single moment, hear me, with a single moment, Jesus offers this paralytic what 38 years of law-abiding Jewish leadership could not offer him: compassion. The Jewish leadership could not offer him compassion for 38 years. And in a single moment, Jesus speaks a word and offers him everything he needed to hear. I've said this before. I parent a teenager, and our 17-year-old is entering his senior year and getting ready to go to college. And one of the things that I've learned, contrary to popular belief, is that I'm learning that a teenager's years aren't primarily for the adults to share their life experiences with them. The teenage years are not for you as the adult or the parent for you to share, not primarily, for you to share your life experiences with. This is what I'm learning, at least. In the past, I've had the tendency to teach. I was a teacher. I was a pastor. I was a youth leader. I would never pass off a teaching moment if I saw one. And so much of that was motivated by the fact that if I don't say it, how is he going to learn it? But while teaching and instruction are undoubtedly really important, so I don't mean to minimize that, but what I am trying to say is that I'm realizing that they're not the most, teaching and instruction are not the most critical ways to show up in a teenager's life. This parenting season is teaching me that teens don't want to be taught as much as they want to be felt. And in fact, I believe nothing prepares teens to learn from adults more than adults' capacity to empathize and understand them. So, church, what I mean to say is this. This man did not need instruction. He needed compassion. He did not need to be reminded of what the law said that he could not do. He needed to be inspired of what was possible with faith in Jesus. He didn't need the letter of the law. He needed the spirit of the law. He didn't need a word from Moses. He needed a word from Jesus. You see, this is precisely what Jesus is offering. And if there is absolutely anything that we gain from Jesus telling this man to pick up his mat and walk, if there's anything that Jesus is declaring, it's this, that the real paralysis isn't this man's inability to walk, but it's the Jewish leaders' inability to choose kindness. That is the real paralysis in this story. You perhaps read the story and think that the paralysis or the disability is in this man's inability to walk, but it's not. It's in the Jewish leaders' inability to choose kindness and compassion. And this is precisely why Romans 7 marks this as Jesus' main goal and mission. I'll read it for us and I'll wrap up. Therefore, my brothers, as Paul says, brothers and sisters, you also were put to death in relation to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to one another. You belong to him who raised him from the dead, in order that you may bear fruit for God. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions aroused through the law were working in us to bear fruit to death. But now you have been released from the law, since you have died to what held us, so that we may serve in newness of the Spirit and in the old letter of the law, and not in the old letter of the law. Look, the uniqueness of Jesus is that he became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth, as John tells us, giving us the grace of his generosity and the truth of our freedom. Lastly, there is no magic in the water, but there is in trust. There is no magic in the water, but there is in trust. The man in this story long believed in the myth that healing was in the water. I just got to get to the water. It's like, I'm not healed because no one's been able to bring me to the water. Anytime I get that, they beat me. This man had long believed that in the myth that the healing was in the water, that if he could just get to the right place at the right time, everything would change. But healing didn't come from superstition or a well-timed activity or moment. It came from the trust that he placed in Jesus' voice, a voice that cut through his despair and offered something that religion could never offer him: presence, power, possibility. You'll see two pictures up here, and it's two pictures of my son and I. When Josiah, our oldest, was 8, we pastored a church up in Dykeman, and when he was 8, we had a baptism service, and we baptized some folks, and at the very end of the service, I asked if anyone wanted to be baptized. In that moment, very spontaneous, Josiah was the first to put his hand up, and he publicly said, "I want to be baptized." It was beautiful. I mean, everybody was in tears, crying, and I said no. My wife and I said no to him. We said no as publicly as he raised his hand. We said no publicly. And I wasn't sure if I was being a bad dad or a bad pastor at that moment. I was very conflicted. But my wife and I felt like he didn't quite fully understand what he was saying yes to. And I think time has vindicated that decision. I never want to be an obstacle to my son's journey, but I do want to be a guide. And so we felt he needed more time. 4 years later, he came to us in the privacy of our bedroom and he said, "I want to get baptized." And so this was after we moved from New York to Atlanta, and in the intimacy of our bathroom, we had some friends in that little tight bathroom. In the intimacy of our bathroom, we baptized our son, and I couldn't think of a better time to have done that. But one of the things that I told my son during that moment was, there's no magic in the water. Right? Because it almost feels like, did we miss the opportunity to baptize him in front of the church? And, did we lose out on that opportunity? But I realized that there's no magic in the water necessarily. But there is in trust. There is power in our ability and our willingness to trust. To trust that God is holding us together when our lives are falling apart. To trust that God's love finds us even in the darkest places where you struggle to see yourself. To trust that God waits to meet you in the future that you're sometimes terrified of. To trust that Jesus holds you while you walk into the places where God is. There's magic, there's power in that. Faith is not a formula, it's a relationship. Trust isn't just believing that God exists, it's believing that God sees you, heals you, and is with you. Ephesians chapter 2, God calls us his pieces of art. In the Greek, it's called poema, which sounds very similar to the Spanish poema, which is this beautiful poetic expression that we are God's poetic expressions. Jesus saw the man by the pool as a masterpiece, not a problem. The religious leaders saw a rule breaker. Jesus saw a man worthy of being restored. Maybe the healing that you're waiting for starts not in the water, but in the voice that you trust. Maybe you've been laying in the same spot for years thinking that God has passed you by, but Jesus is still asking you today, do you want to be healed? Maybe you're the one that's doing the watching. Maybe you're the one that's been like the religious leader, the rule keeper, and Jesus is asking you as well, can you choose compassion over control? Renaissance, I hope that you don't miss the real work of art in this passage. It may be in the child who still finds wonder in the world. It may be in the man who stands after 38 years of not being able to, or maybe, just maybe, it's in you and in this invitation that Jesus and his empty tomb are offering us. My prayer is that you would let Jesus speak a liberating word over your fear, over your paralysis, over your waiting. Let us trust in the miracle that moves us to faith. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for your kindness. Holy Spirit, I pray that you would shake and move and unsettle and inspire, motivate and enliven us toward faith in Jesus, that we too can hear that he offers us this word. Do we want to be healed? And that he gives it to us. That he gives it to us. Thank you, Jesus. We pray in your name. Amen.